The night Milstead burned, they say you could see the flames from 3 counties away. Some folks claimed it was divine judgment. Others blamed the drought that had turned the once prosperous mining town into kindling. But Sarah Calloway knew better. With her husband 6 months in the ground and 3 identical 5-year-old daughters to feed, she recognized the scent of kerosene when it filled her nostrils. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As the flames closed in around her modest home at the edge of town, Sarah realized she had been left behind. Deliberately. What no one expected was that their fates would become entangled with the most feared man in the territory. A bounty hunter, so ruthless that outlaws would surrender rather than face him. They called him the Raven. Most never learned his real name. Even fewer lived to tell what happened when they crossed him. But before this night was through, the Raven would risk everything to save the widow and her triplets, and in doing so perhaps find redemption for the darkness that had consumed him for so long. Milstead, Wyoming Territory. April 1878. Sarah Calloway's fingers trembled as she lit the last kerosene lamp in her modest kitchen. Outside, the spring night had turned unseasonably cold, and the wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls of the house that Thomas had built with his own hands. In the corner bedroom, her 5-year-old triplet daughters, Mary, Elizabeth, and Catherine, slept soundly, their identical faces peaceful despite the mounting tension in town. They were blissfully unaware of the whispers that had begun to circulate after the mine collapse that had claimed their father and 11 other men. Sarah brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face and stared at the nearly empty pantry. Thomas had been dead 6 months, and the meager compensation from the Milstead Mining Company had run out weeks ago. The company store had cut off her credit yesterday. The girls hadn't had milk in days. One problem at a time, she whispered to herself, the mantra that had kept her going since the accident. A sharp knock at the door startled her. Sarah glanced at the grandfather clock. Nearly midnight. No decent visitor would come at such an hour. When she opened the door, Walter Preston, the mine owner's son, stood on her porch, his expensive coat buttoned against the cold. Behind him, 2 company men waited by their horses. "Mrs. Calloway," Preston said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May I come in?" Sarah clutched her shawl tighter. "It's rather late, Mr. Preston. This can't wait until morning." Without waiting for permission, he stepped inside, surveying the modest home with thinly veiled disdain. "I've come with a proposition that could solve all your difficulties." Sarah remained standing, her back rigid. "What proposition?" "The town council met today. Milstead is finished, Sarah. The main vein has played out. The company's pulling out." The news hit her like a physical blow. "But what about the townspeople? There are families. Everyone's been informed. They're packing up as we speak. Company wagons leave at dawn." He stepped closer. "I've arranged a passage for you and your daughters to Cheyenne. My aunt runs a respectable boarding house there." "And what would I do in Cheyenne?" Preston's smile widened. "My aunt always needs help with laundry and cooking. You'd have a roof over your head. Your girls would be fed." "As servants," Sarah said flatly. "As survivors, Mrs. Calloway, which is more than I can say will happen if you stay." He glanced around the room. "The company owns this house. Once we're gone, Milstead will become a ghost town. Or worse, there are unsavory elements just waiting to move in. This was my husband's house. He built it with his own hands. On company land, with company lumber," Preston countered. "Look, I'm trying to help you. Thomas would have wanted—" "Don't tell me what my husband would have wanted," Sarah interrupted, her voice low but sharp. "Thomas wanted justice. The company knew those support beams were rotting. He reported it 3 times. Preston's face hardened. "Careful, Mrs. Calloway. Grief has made you irrational. No one forced Thomas to work in that mine. No, just starvation and the company's store debt that kept growing no matter how many hours he worked. Sarah stepped toward the door. Thank you for the warning about the town, Mr. Preston. We'll make our own arrangements. Don't be foolish. You have 3 children to think about. I think about nothing else. Preston's face flushed with anger. The wagons leave at dawn. Be on them, or you're on your own. He paused at the door. And Sarah, I'd pack tonight if I were you. There's talk of fire. The threat hung in the air between them. Are you threatening me, Mr. Preston? Warning you, these mining camps, accidents happen. He tipped his hat. Good evening, Mrs. Calloway. After he left, Sarah leaned against the door, her heart pounding. Through the window, she could see lanterns moving throughout the town, the silhouettes of wagons being loaded. Why hadn't anyone told her? Then she remembered how the townspeople had pulled away after she'd started asking questions about the mine collapse, after she'd demanded an investigation. Sarah moved to the girls' room and gazed at their sleeping forms. Mary, the oldest by 7 minutes, slept with her arms wrapped around her favorite rag doll. Elizabeth, always restless, had kicked off her blankets. Catherine, the quietest of the 3, slept with her thumb in her mouth, despite Sarah's gentle attempts to break the habit. They were all she had left of Thomas. 3 perfect little girls with his sky-blue eyes and stubborn chin. Dawn was only hours away. She would need to pack, to figure out where they could go. Her parents were long dead, and Thomas's family back east had made it clear they had no room for a widow and 3 children. Sarah was contemplating her limited options when she smelled it, the unmistakable odor of kerosene. She rushed to the window and saw shadows moving between houses. In the distance, the first flames leaped skyward from the abandoned miners' barracks. Sarah threw open the trunk at the foot of her bed and began throwing in essentials, clothes for the girls, Thomas's pocket watch, the family Bible, the tin box with their few valuables. She had just reached for her late mother's silver hairbrush when the first rock shattered her front window. "Time's up, Calloway!" a voice shouted from outside. "Preston says you're either on those wagons or you burn with the trash." Sarah ran to the girls' room as another rock crashed through their window, showering glass across the floor. The triplets awoke, screaming in terror. "Mama? What's happening?" Mary cried as Sarah gathered them up. "We need to leave now, darlings. Put on your boots and coats." Sarah's voice was calmer than she felt as she helped each girl dress. Through the window, she could see that multiple buildings were now ablaze. The company men weren't just abandoning Milstead, they were destroying it, erasing any evidence of their neglect and greed. Sarah realized with sickening clarity that Preston had never intended for her to reach those wagons. This visit had been his alibi. He had warned her, offered her passage. If she died in the fire, who would question it? Just another tragedy in a dying mining town. She led the girls through the house, grabbing the trunk and a small bag of provisions. But when she opened the front door, flames already blocked their path to the main road. The fire had spread with unnatural speed, fueled by deliberately spilled kerosene. "Back door," Sarah ordered, pulling the frightened children toward the kitchen. But as they reached it, a burning timber from the adjacent shed crashed against it. They were surrounded. The cellar, Sarah decided, leading them to the trapdoor beneath the kitchen table. Thomas had dug it deep, lined it with stone to store potatoes, and preserved jars through Wyoming's harsh winters. "I don't want to go down there, Mama," Elizabeth whimpered. "It's dark." "Just for a little while, sweetheart," Sarah soothed, lighting a candle. Like a game of hide-and-seek. She helped them down the ladder, then brought the trunk and provisions, closing the trapdoor above them just as the kitchen ceiling began to smoke. The cellar was cool and damp, the stone walls offering some protection. But Sarah knew it wouldn't last. The house above them was wooden, and the fire was moving fast. The girls huddled together on an old quilt as Sarah frantically searched for another way out. Thomas had once mentioned a drainage tunnel he'd dug that led to the creek bed, but she'd never seen it. With growing desperation, she moved, preserving jars and crates, feeling along the walls for any opening. Above them, they could hear the house beginning to collapse, timbers groaning as they surrendered to the flames. Smoke seeped through the cracks around the trapdoor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mama, I can't breathe," Catherine coughed, the smallest of the triplets already struggling with the thickening air. Sarah finally found it, a narrow opening behind a stack of crates, barely visible in the dim candlelight. A rough-hewn tunnel, just large enough for a person to crawl through. "Girls, I need you to be very brave now," Sarah said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "We're going to play a new game, like rabbits in a burrow." She arranged them in a line, Mary first, then Elizabeth, then Catherine, and showed them how to crawl into the tunnel. "Just keep going until you reach the end. Don't stop, no matter what." "What about you, Mama?" Mary asked, always perceptive beyond her years. "I'll be right behind you with our things." Sarah kissed each small forehead. "Now go, quickly." The tunnel was tight and rough, cut through Wyoming soil and rock by Thomas's determined hands. Sarah watched anxiously as each child disappeared into the darkness, then pushed their small trunk in after them. She was about to follow when a terrifying crack came from above. The trapdoor splintered as a burning beam crashed through it, sending flaming debris into the cellar. Sarah barely had time to shield her face before part of the kitchen floor collapsed, blocking the tunnel entrance with burning wood and debris. Through a gap in the wreckage, she could see the terrified faces of her daughters, now trapped on the other side. "Go!" Sarah shouted over the roar of the fire. "Follow the tunnel to the creek! Don't wait for me!" "Mama!" The girls screamed in unison, their identical faces smeared with dirt and tears. "I'll find another way out. I'll meet you at the creek." "Go now," Sarah commanded, using the stern voice that even the strong-willed triplets knew better than to disobey. She watched through tears as Mary finally pulled her sisters deeper into the tunnel, away from the advancing flames. Sarah turned to face the burning cellar, searching desperately for any escape route as the smoke grew thicker around her. 10 miles outside of Milstead, Elijah Drake reined in his black stallion on a rocky outcrop. In the distance, the night sky glowed orange with the unmistakable light of a massive fire. Drake's weathered face remained impassive beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. At 43, there were few sights in the Wyoming territory that could surprise him anymore. Towns lived and died quickly in this part of the country, especially mining operations like Milstead. But something about this fire felt deliberate. Even from this distance, he absently traced the scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in Laramie 7 years ago, and considered his options. His business in Milstead could wait if the whole place was going up in flames. The bounty on Jacob Mercer would still be there tomorrow, and the tracks he'd been following suggested Mercer was heading toward the Montana line anyway. Drake had earned his fearsome reputation as the Raven through cold efficiency rather than cruelty. He brought in his quarry alive when possible, dead when necessary, but he always brought them in. He wasn't known for detours or acts of charity, yet something drew his gaze back to the burning town. He'd visited Milstead twice before while tracking other fugitives. It had been a typical company town, owned and controlled by the Milstead Mining Company, with the usual mix of hard-working families and the rougher element that followed mining. Operations. Drake pulled out his spyglass and studied the distant inferno more closely. The fire pattern was strange, not spreading naturally from a single point, but erupting in multiple locations simultaneously. This was no accident. With a sigh, he tucked away the spyglass and nudged his horse down the trail toward the burning town. He told himself he was just being thorough, checking if his fugitive might have stopped there before moving on. But a deeper instinct, one he rarely acknowledged, pushed him forward. As he approached Milstead, the devastation became clearer. The fire had already consumed most of the town centre. What surprised Drake was the absence of any organized firefighting effort. In his experience, even the roughest frontier settlements pulled together when flames threatened to devour everything. On the outskirts, he passed abandoned wagons loaded with personal belongings, as if the owners had fled in panic. Drake slowed his horse to examine the ground, reading the story written in tracks and discarded items. A hasty evacuation, then. But why abandon possessions they'd taken the time to pack? The answer came as he crested a small rise overlooking what remained of Milstead. On the far side of town, a convoy of wagons was moving away, company wagons by the look of them, traveling fast despite the darkness. Moving away from the fire they had likely set. Drake's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before. Mining companies burning their own played-out camps, destroying records and evidence of their operations. Usually, they at least warned the residents. The heat hit him like a wall as he guided his horse carefully through what had been the main street. Most buildings were fully engulfed or already collapsed into smoldering ruins. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of kerosene. No survivors would be found here. Drake was about to turn back when a faint sound caught his attention, high-pitched and desperate, barely audible over the crackling flames. Children's voices. Drake dismounted and tied his nervous horse to a stone hitching post that had somehow survived the inferno. With a bandana pulled over his nose and mouth, he moved toward the sound, his experienced eyes scanning for a path through the flames. The cries led him toward a creek bed at the eastern edge of town. As he scrambled down the steep bank, boots sliding on loose shale, Drake spotted them. 3 small girls, identical in appearance, huddled together beside a narrow tunnel opening in the creek bank. They were filthy, coughing from smoke inhalation, their nightclothes covered in dirt. "Mama!" one of them sobbed when she saw Drake, her hope quickly turning to fear at the sight of the intimidating stranger. Drake approached slowly, crouching, to appear less threatening. "Are you alone out here?" he asked, his voice gentler than most would believe him capable of. "Our mama's trapped," another girl cried, pointing back toward what Drake now realized was some kind of drainage tunnel. "The fire's got her." Drake peered into the tunnel, seeing only darkness punctuated by a distant orange glow. "She's in there. Where does this lead?" "Our house," the third girl whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke. "The bad men set it on fire." Drake made a quick decision. "Stay right here," he instructed, shrugging off his heavy coat and gun belt. "Don't move from this spot. Understand?" The triplets nodded in frightened unison. The tunnel was a tight fit for Drake's broad shoulders. He crawled forward on his elbows, grateful for the leather gloves that protected his hands from the rough stone and earth. The passage gradually sloped upward, and the air grew hotter and thicker with smoke. After what seemed an eternity of painful crawling, Drake reached a cave-in where burning debris blocked the path. Through gaps in the wreckage, he could see into what appeared to be a root cellar, now partially collapsed and filled with smoke. On the far side, barely visible, a woman was slumped against the stone wall, unconscious or worse. "Ma'am!" Drake called out. When she didn't respond, he began tearing at the burning debris with his gloved hands, ignoring the pain as embers seared through the leather to the skin beneath. The blockage was too solid to break through quickly. The woman would be dead from smoke inhalation long before he could reach her this way. Drake backed out of the tunnel faster than he'd entered it, mind racing. There had to be another entrance to that cellar, likely through the burning house above. It was a desperate gamble, but the only chance the woman had. When he emerged from the tunnel, the triplets were exactly where he'd left them, clinging to each other, Your mama's alive, but I need to go in another way, Drake explained tersely, retrieving his coat and weapons. Which house is yours? The girls pointed to a partially collapsed structure about 50 yards from the creek bank. Unlike the buildings in town, this one still had some intact walls, though the roof was fully engulfed in flames. Stay here, Drake ordered again. He hesitated, then added, What's your mama's name? Sarah, the boldest girl answered. Sarah Calloway. The name tickled something in Drake's memory, but he pushed the thought aside. There was no time for distractions. He approached the burning house from the rear, studying it with the same calculating intensity he used when tracking fugitives. The back door was blocked by fallen debris, but a kitchen window had been blown out by the heat, leaving an opening just large enough for a man to squeeze through. Drake wrapped his coat around his head and upper body and dove through the opening, landing hard on a floor that groaned ominously beneath his weight. The heat was suffocating, even through the heavy coat. Flames licked at the walls and what remained of the ceiling, turning the small house into a furnace. Through the smoke, he spotted the splintered trapdoor. Drake dropped to his knees and peered into the cellar below. There she was, Sarah Calloway, crumpled against the far wall. To his relief, he saw her chest rise and fall, still breathing, but not for long in this smoke. The floor beneath him creaked and shifted. It would not support his weight if he tried to climb down normally. Without hesitation, Drake tied one end of his rope to a still intact beam and the other around his waist. Then he slid through the trapdoor opening, using the rope to control his descent. The cellar air was marginally better than above, but rapidly deteriorating as more of the burning house collapsed. Drake reached the unconscious woman and gently lifted her face, checking for signs of life. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow, but her pulse still beat steadily against his fingers. "Mrs. Calloway," he said loudly, tapping her cheek. "Sarah, wake up!" Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. Disoriented green eyes met his, widening with fear at the sight of the scarred stranger. "Your daughters sent me," Drake explained quickly. "They're safe by the creek. Can you stand?" Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by determination. She nodded weakly. Drake helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as her legs threatened to buckle. Above them, the remainder of the kitchen floor gave way with a thunderous crash, sending a shower of burning debris into the cellar and filling the small space with fresh smoke and flames. The rope he had used to descend was now burning. The path upward completely blocked. Sarah Calloway's gaze met his despair, battling with a mother's fierce will to survive. "The tunnel," she gasped, pointing to where the entrance had been. "Can we clear it?" Drake assessed the collapsed entrance critically. "Not in time." He scanned the cellar with practiced eyes, searching for any other possibility. The stone walls would eventually channel the heat like an oven, but for now they offered some protection. If there was a way to redirect the worst of the flames, Drake spotted a trapdoor in the cellar floor that likely led to a deeper storage area, or perhaps a well. It was their only chance. "That door," he directed. "What's below it?" Sarah followed, his gaze. "An old mining shaft. Thomas, my husband, found it when digging the cellar. It's unstable. Better than certain death," Drake decided, pulling her toward it. The mining shaft gaped beneath them like a hungry mouth, a black void promising either salvation or a quicker death. Drake tested the trapdoor's hinges, rusted but intact, and pulled it open with a protesting groan of metal. "I'll go first," he said, already lowering himself into the darkness. "Test if it'll hold." Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. The cellar was becoming unbearable, flames now licking at the wooden beams overhead. She watched as Drake disappeared into the shaft, his movements deliberate despite the urgency of their situation. "It's stable enough," his voice echoed up after a moment. "About 8 feet down. I'll catch you." Sarah took one final look around the cellar where she'd stored preserves for winter. where Thomas had taught the girls to identify different types of potatoes by touch alone during their games of blindman's buff. Then she turned and lowered herself into the shaft, feet first, feeling Drake's strong hands grip her ankles, then her waist as she descended. The air was mercifully clearer below, though the orange glow of flames still illuminated the rough-hewn passage. Drake produced a small tin miner's lamp from his pack and lit it, revealing a tunnel that extended in two directions. "Your husband worked the mines?" Drake asked, studying the tunnel's construction. Sarah nodded, still catching her breath. "He was a shift foreman before the collapse. Which way leads out of town?" Sarah pointed east. "That branch eventually connects to a ventilation shaft that comes out near Miller's Ridge, if it hasn't collapsed. Thomas mapped all the tunnels. He didn't trust the company engineers." "Smart man," Drake muttered, already moving in the direction she'd indicated. "Stay close. These support beams are older than they look." They moved in silence for several minutes. The only sounds were their footsteps and the distant rumble of the burning town collapsing above them. Sarah fought to keep pace with Drake's longer strides, her thoughts constantly returning to her daughters waiting by the creek bed. "My girls," she finally said. "Are they truly safe?" Found them huddled together by the tunnel exit. "Brave little things, refused to leave without their mama." Drake glanced back at her. "You taught them well." The simple compliment nearly broke her composure. Sarah blinked back tears and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. "They're all I have left." Drake nodded, but said nothing more. They continued through the winding tunnel, which gradually began to slope upward. The air grew fresher, though still tinged with smoke from the fire raging above. After what seemed hours, but was likely only 30 minutes, Drake held up a hand for her to stop. "Ventilation shaft ahead. I can feel the draft." The shaft was narrow, barely, wide enough for Drake's shoulders, and ascended at a steep angle for about 15 feet before opening to the night sky. Crude handholds had been cut into the rock. "Ladies first," Drake said, offering a boost. "I'll be right behind you." The climb was arduous, Sarah's arms trembling with fatigue by the time she reached the top. She pulled herself out onto cool grass and turned to help Drake, who emerged moments later with considerably more grace, despite his larger frame. They found themselves on a scrubby hillside overlooking what remained of Milstead. From this vantage point, the full scale of destruction was apparent, the entire town engulfed in flames, thick smoke blotting out the stars. In the distance, the company wagon train continued its hasty retreat, now merely pinpricks of lantern light in the darkness. "We need to find my daughters," Sarah said, already starting down the hillside toward the creek where Drake had left them. "Wait," Drake caught her arm. "That route takes us too close to the fire. We'll circle around from the north." Sarah bristled at the command, but saw the wisdom in his caution. She followed his lead, moving quickly but carefully down the rocky slope. As they navigated through scrub oak and patches of melting spring snow, she studied her unlikely rescuer more closely. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the coiled readiness of a predator, even in repose. The scar that ran down the right side of his face pulled slightly at his eye, giving him a perpetually wary expression. His clothes were trail-worn, but of good quality. Dark trousers, a charcoal shirt now smudged with soot, and a leather vest with pockets that likely concealed various weapons. "You have a name, sir?" Sarah finally asked. "I should know who to thank for saving our lives." "Elijah Drake." He offered the information without embellishment or expectation. The name sparked recognition. "The bounty hunter? The one they call the Raven?" Drake finished for her, his expression unchanged. "Yes." Sarah fell silent, reconciling the fearsome reputation with the man who had risked his life to save her and her children. She'd heard the whispered stories in town, how he'd tracked the Franklin gang across 3 territories without rest, how outlaws surrendered rather than face him, how he brought in Adam Blackwood's body slung over a horse after the murderer. Had sworn he'd never be taken alive. "What brings a man like you to a dying mining town?" she finally asked. "Tracking a fugitive. Jacob Mercer. Killed a bank teller in Casper last month." "I know of no Mercer in Milstead." Tracks led this direction. Drake's eyes continuously scanned their surroundings as they talked, missing nothing. "Doesn't matter now. First priority is getting you and your girls somewhere safe." "And where?" "Would that be, Mr. Drake?" Sarah couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "The company owns everything for 50 miles. Preston made it clear I'm not welcome on their property anymore." Drake considered this as they navigated a dry stream bed. "There's a trading post at Junction Creek about 2 days' ride north. Man named Harlan Sullivan runs it, former Army scout, good man. 2 days is a long journey with 3 5-year-olds and no horse," Sarah observed. "We'll manage with 1 horse for a while. I've survived worse." The matter-of-fact confidence in his voice gave Sarah her first glimmer of hope since Preston's threat. Before she could respond, they crested a small rise, and the creek came into view below. Sarah's heart lurched. The spot where Drake had left the triplets was empty. "They were right there," Drake said, his voice tense as he pointed to a flattened area beside the tunnel opening. He dropped to one knee, examining the ground. 3 sets of small prints, heading north along the creek bed. He pointed to larger boot prints among them, and they weren't alone. Fear clawed at Sarah's throat. "Preston's men." Drake shook his head. "Different tread pattern." He studied the tracks for another moment. 4 men. Not company boots, heavier, probably miners. He rose and whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that carried despite the distant roar of the fire. Moments later, a large black horse appeared from a copse of trees downstream, approaching cautiously. "Your daughters might have spooked when I didn't." "Return," Drake theorized as he checked his mount's saddle. "If other survivors found them, they might have taken them somewhere safer, or they could have been taken by claim jumpers," Sarah countered, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. The kind of men who'd rush into a burning town hoping to find abandoned valuables. Drake checked the loads in his revolver before holstering it. "Let's not assume the worst yet. The tracks are fresh, not more than 20 minutes old. We can catch up before dawn." He mounted the stallion and extended a hand down to Sarah. "Your choice, Mrs. Calloway. Mount up and we'll find your girls together, or stay here waiting while I track them alone." Sarah took his hand without hesitation and allowed him to pull her up behind him. "Together." Drake nodded once and nudged the horse forward, following the creek downstream where the tracks led. "Hold tight," he instructed, "and stay quiet. Sound carries at night." Sarah wrapped her arms around his waist, fighting exhaustion as the adrenaline that had kept her going began to ebb. The rhythmic movement of the horse threatened to lull her into sleep, but concern for her daughters kept her alert, her eyes constantly scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. They rode in silence. For nearly an hour, Drake periodically dismounting to check the tracks when the ground became rocky or the trail less obvious. The fire behind them gradually dimmed as they put distance between themselves and the ruined town, though the sky still glowed with its angry light. "They stopped here," Drake announced suddenly, sliding from the saddle beside a small clearing. Built a fire. Sarah dismounted and examined the hastily constructed camp, a small fire pit with still warm embers, flattened grass where people had sat, and a discarded whiskey bottle. "My girls don't drink whiskey," she said quietly, dread building in her chest. Drake's face hardened as he examined something in the dirt. He picked up a small object and held it out to Sarah, a tiny button carved like a flower painted blue. "Elizabeth's," Sarah confirmed, her voice breaking, "from her nightdress. Thomas carved them special for her last birthday." Drake closed his fist around the button and surveyed the abandoned campsite with new intensity. 4 men, 3 children. They didn't stay long, just long enough to rest and decide where to go. He pointed to a clear set of tracks leading west. They're keeping off the main trails, heading for the mountains. "Why take my daughters?" Sarah whispered, though she feared. She already knew the answer. Orphaned children were valuable commodities on the frontier, for labor, for ransom if they had wealthy relatives, or for worse purposes she couldn't bear to contemplate. Questions later. Finding them now is what matters. Drake helped her back, onto the horse. The good news is they're slowed by having the children with them. We can catch up by morning if we push hard. They rode relentlessly through the night, stopping only when necessary to check the trail. Drake proved to be a master tracker, finding signs invisible to Sarah's untrained eye. A broken twig here, a scuff mark in the dirt there, the subtle depression where a child had stumbled and been picked up again. As first light tinged the eastern sky, they found themselves in increasingly rugged country, low foothills that would eventually rise to the mountains proper. The terrain slowed their pursuit, forcing them to dismount and lead the horse through rocky passages. "They're tiring," Drake observed, kneeling beside a fresh set of tracks. "Making mistakes. The big one, their leader, I think, keeps doubling. Back to cover their trail, but he's getting sloppy." He pointed to a small footprint, partially overlapping a man's boot print. "The girls are still walking. That's something." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Exhaustion and fear had left her hollow, functioning purely on a mother's desperate determination. Drake studied her face. "We should rest. Just for an hour. You're dead on your feet, and I'll be no good to your daughters if I miss signs because I'm tired." "I can keep going," Sarah insisted. Admirable but foolish. Drake's voice was firm but not unkind. "An hour's rest now might save hours of backtracking later if we lose the trail." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. They found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock, and Drake unsaddled his horse, allowing the animal to graze nearby. He produced jerky and a canteen from his saddlebags, offering them to Sarah first. "Eat!" he commanded when she hesitated. "You'll need strength." The jerky was tough and salty, but Sarah forced herself to chew methodically, washing it down with careful sips of water. As she ate, she found herself studying Drake again. His movements were economical, nothing wasted, every action deliberate. He positioned himself where he could watch both their back trail and the path ahead, one hand never far from his revolver. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah finally asked. "This isn't your fight." Drake continued scanning their surroundings, his expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." He was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I have my reasons." "That's not an answer." Drake met her gaze directly. "You want the truth, Mrs. Calloway? I've spent 15 years hunting men, bringing them to justice or what passes for it out here. Some deserved it, others were just desperate." He looked away. "I've become very good at causing pain. Thought it might be time to prevent some instead." The simple honesty of his response silenced any further questions. Sarah leaned back against the rock face and closed her eyes, intending only to rest them for a moment. Despite her determination to stay alert, exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. When she awoke with a start, the sun had risen fully above the horizon. Drake was already saddling the horse, his movements swift and silent. "You let me sleep," she accused, scrambling to her feet. "You needed it." Drake tightened the saddle cinch, and they've stopped moving, made camp about a mile ahead in a box. "Canyon. I scouted it while you rested." Sarah's heart leaped. "My girls. Did you see them?" Drake nodded. "All 3. Scared but unharmed from what I could tell. They're keeping them in one of the abandoned mine shacks at the canyon's end." "Who are these men? What do they want with my daughters?" "They're Harlan's crew, not miners, outlaws. They worked the area around Milstead last year, robbing stages and prospectors. Thought they'd moved on. Drake checked the loads in his rifle before sliding it into its scabbard. As for what they want, I heard enough to know they plan to take the girls to Bozeman. There's a man there who pays for orphans, no questions asked. A slaver, Sarah whispered, horror closing her throat. Of a sort. Drake's face was grim. Children fetch a good price from certain wealthy families back east looking for servants, or from frontier brothels wanting to train girls young. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. We need to get them back, now. We will. Drake's voice held absolute certainty. But we do it my way. Those men are killers, Mrs. Calloway. If we rush in without a plan, your daughters could be caught in the crossfire. What do you propose? Drake outlined his strategy as they made their way carefully toward the canyon, leading the horse to minimize noise. The plan was simple. Sarah would create a distraction at the canyon entrance, while Drake circled around to approach the mine shack from above. In the confusion, he would extract the girls while the outlaws were focused on the perceived threat at the canyon mouth. These men know me by reputation, Drake explained. If they realize I'm here, they won't hesitate to use your daughters as leverage. They need to think you're alone, just a desperate mother who followed them. I am a desperate mother who followed them, Sarah pointed out. Then it won't be hard to convince them. Drake handed her a small Derringer pistol from his boot. 2 shots. Use them only if you have no choice. They separated at the canyon entrance, Drake disappearing into the rocks above, while Sarah waited. And for his signal, a hawk's cry that would indicate he was in position. The minutes stretched interminably as she crouched behind a boulder, the small gun cold in her palm. When the signal finally came, Sarah took a deep breath and stumbled into the open, allowing her genuine exhaustion to show. She called out her daughters' names, her voice cracking with emotion that required no pretense. The response was immediate. A tall, bearded man emerged from behind a cluster of boulders midway down the canyon, rifle trained on her. That's far. Enough, lady, he called out. Hands where I can see him. Sarah raised her hands, keeping the tiny Derringer concealed in her sleeve as Drake had shown her. Please, she begged, I just want my daughters. Your daughters? The man feigned surprise. Don't know what you're talking about, ma'am. You must be confused from the fire. I know you have them, Mr. Harlan, Sarah said, using the name Drake had given her. Mary, Elizabeth, and Catherine. They're only 5 years old, please. Harlan's expression darkened at the use of his name. You know too much for your own good, lady. How'd you find us? I followed your tracks. I'm alone. I'll give you anything you want. Just let me have my girls. A second man emerged from the shack at the canyon's end, followed by 2 more from hiding places among the rocks. All were armed, their expressions ranging from wariness to outright hostility. She's alone, one called Harlan. Says she is. Harlan kept his rifle trained on Sarah. Search her, Maddox. The second man approached cautiously, roughly patting Sarah down until he found the Derringer. He laughed, holding it up. Some protection. Lady, this wouldn't stop a coyote. Check the ridge, Harlan ordered the third man. Make sure she's telling the truth about being alone. Sarah's heart raced. Drake needed more time. She fell to her knees, playing up her exhaustion. Please, she sobbed. They're all I have left. Their father died in the mine collapse. We've suffered enough. Harlan regarded her dispassionately. Life's full of suffering, ma'am. Your girls will learn that same as everyone. He signaled to the fourth man. Bring them out. Let her see they're alive at least. Might make her more cooperative. The fourth outlaw disappeared into the shack and returned moments later with the triplets, herding them before him like lambs. The girls were dirty and frightened, their identical faces streaked with tears, but otherwise appeared unharmed. "Mama!" they cried in unison when they spotted Sarah. "Stay where you are," Harlan barked when they tried to run to her. He turned back to Sarah. Here's how this works. We need supplies and fresh horses for the trip north. You're going to ride into Junction Creek and get them for us. You try to bring back the law or don't come back at all. Your girls pay the price. Understand?" Before Sarah could respond, a cold voice spoke from the rocks above them. "She's not going anywhere, Harlan. Neither are you." The outlaws whirled, weapons raised toward the voice, but Drake was nowhere to be seen. "That you, Raven?" Harlan called, a tremor in his voice betraying his recognition of the infamous bounty hunter. "You know it is." Drake's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Let the girls go, and maybe you walk away from this." "Not happening," Harlan growled, grabbing the nearest triplet, Catherine, and pressing his gun to her head. "You know how this works. Show yourself or the kid dies." A tense silence followed. Sarah locked eyes with her daughter, trying to convey courage through her gaze alone. Catherine's lips trembled, but she didn't cry out. "5 seconds, Raven," Harlan shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. 5, 4... A shot rang out, deafening in the confines of the canyon. Harlan screamed and dropped to his knees, his rifle spinning away as he clutched his shattered right hand. Catherine bolted toward her mother as the other outlaws dove for cover. A second shot felled the man called Maddox as he tried to use one of the other triplets as a shield. The bullet took him cleanly through the shoulder, causing him to release the child with a howl of pain. "Get down!" Drake's voice commanded from above. Sarah grabbed her daughters and pulled them behind a boulder as a fusillade of shots erupted. From the outlaws' positions, Drake's return fire was measured and precise, never wasteful, each shot finding its mark. When the echoes finally died away, 3 of the outlaws lay wounded, their weapons kicked far from reach. Of Harlan himself there was no sign. Drake materialized beside Sarah and the girls, seeming to step from the very rocks themselves. "Are you hurt?" he asked, checking each child quickly but thoroughly. "Just scared," Sarah answered, holding her. "Oh, daughter's close. Where's Harlan? Ran when his men fell. He won't get far." Drake reloaded his revolver methodically. "I need to secure these 3 before they find their courage again. Stay here." Sarah watched as Drake efficiently bound the wounded outlaws, his movements brisk but not cruel. He checked their injuries, applying rough tourniquets where needed. None would die from their wounds, she realized. Drake had shot to incapacitate, not kill. "The cowards took my horse," he reported when he returned. "Harlan must have circled back during the gunfight." "What now?" Sarah asked, still cradling her daughters, who had finally begun to relax in her embrace. "Now we walk." Drake glanced at the triplets. "Unless these young ladies are too tired?" Mary, always the boldest, squared her small shoulders. "We can walk, Mr. Raven." A ghost of a smile touched Drake's scarred face. "It's just Drake, little miss. And I know you can." He knelt to their level. "You 3 are the bravest children I've ever met. Your pa would be proud." The simple words brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, not wanting to frighten the girls further. "How far to this Junction Creek trading post?" "About 15 miles as the crow flies. Longer by the trail we'll need to take." Drake shouldered his rifle. "We'll camp tonight and reach Sullivan's by tomorrow afternoon." As they left the canyon, Sarah glanced back at the bound outlaws. "What about them? And Harlan?" "Sullivan will send men for them when we reach the trading post. As for Harlan..." Drake's expression hardened. "Some trails don't end until I decide they do," with the triplets taking turns riding on Drake's shoulders. When their small legs tired, they set out across the Wyoming wilderness, putting distance between themselves and the smoldering ruins of Milstead. The journey ahead would be arduous, Sarah knew, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something akin to hope. As they crested a ridge and paused to rest, Drake pointed to a distant plume of smoke rising lazily from beyond the next valley. "Sullivan's place," he explained. "Man smokes more venison than any 3 families could eat in a year." Will we be welcome there? Sarah asked quietly, while the girls explored a nearby patch of wildflowers under her watchful eye. Drake nodded. Sullivan owes me a favor or three, and he has a soft spot for children. Lost his own daughter to cholera some years back. And after that? Where do people go when they've lost everything? Drake studied her for a long moment. You haven't lost everything, Mrs. Calloway. He nodded toward the triplets, and as for where to go, he shrugged. West is full of fresh starts for those brave enough to claim them. Sarah watched her daughters, dirty, exhausted, but alive and together, and found herself nodding. Then, west it is, Mr. Drake, just as soon as we've settled a final score with Walter Preston and his mining company. The look that passed between them held a shared understanding. Some injustices could not go unanswered. Some debts had to be paid in full. Drake touched the brim of his hat in silent agreement before turning to help Mary over a fallen log. West it is, Mrs. Calloway, after we finish our business here. Ahead of them, Junction Creek awaited with a temporary sanctuary. Beyond that lay uncertain paths and the promise of justice or vengeance. For now, it was enough that they had survived the night that Milstead burned, that her daughters were safe, and that in the most unlikely of saviors, Sarah had found an ally whose fearsome reputation might yet serve a noble purpose. As the sun climbed higher in the Wyoming sky, they continued their journey across the untamed wilderness, 4 survivors bound together by fire and circumstance, their story far from finished. Sullivan's trading post appeared first as wisps of wood smoke, curling above the pines, then as a cluster of sturdy log buildings nestled in a natural clearing beside Junction Creek. As Sarah and Drake approached with the exhausted triplets, the distinctive sounds of frontier commerce greeted them, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of traders haggling, horses nickering in corrals. "Stay close," Drake advised, lifting Catherine onto his shoulders as the other 2 girls clung to Sarah's hands. "Sullivan runs a clean establishment, but frontier trading posts attract all types." The main building was a sprawling 2-story affair, with a wide porch and hitching posts out front. A hand-painted sign proclaimed Sullivan's Trading Post and Lodging above the door. Several men lounging on the porch straightened as Drake approached, their expressions shifting from curiosity to wariness as they recognized him. "Raven," one muttered, touching his hat brim before ducking inside, presumably to alert Sullivan. They had barely reached the steps when the door swung open, revealing a mountain of a man with a silver-streaked beard and eyes as blue and sharp as mountain lakes. He wore a stained leather apron over a faded blue shirt, and a Smith & Wesson revolver hung prominently from his belt. "Drake," he rumbled, his voice as deep as distant thunder. "Been 3 winters since you graced my establishment." His gaze traveled to Sarah and the triplets, brows rising in surprise. "And with company, no less." "Sullivan," Drake nodded curtly. "Mrs. Sarah Calloway and her daughters need sanctuary. Milstead's gone, burned to the ground by the mining company." Sullivan's bushy eyebrows drew together. "Heard rumors from travelers. This morning. Didn't credit half of them." He knelt, bringing himself eye-level with the triplets, who shrank against their mother. His stern expression softened. "3 little identical angels, is it? You girls hungry?" Mary, ever the bravest, nodded solemnly. Sullivan smiled, revealing surprisingly even teeth. "Mrs. Lorna," he called over his shoulder, "we got guests needing feeding and a hot bath." A stout woman with iron-grey hair appeared in the doorway, clucking her tongue at the sight of the bedraggled group. "Land's sake, Harlan Sullivan, don't leave these poor souls standing in the yard." She bustled down the steps, somehow managing to gather all 3 triplets into her ample embrace at once. Come in, you poor dears, look half-starved and fully done in." Sarah found herself shepherded into the trading post's rear quarters, a surprisingly cozy living area behind the store. Mrs. Sullivan, Lorna, efficiently organized hot baths for everyone, starting with the girls. Sarah could only watch in grateful amazement as this stranger washed her daughter's hair with lavender-scented soap, cooed over their scrapes and bruises, and dressed them in clean nightgowns that had belonged to her own children ages ago. "Our son Jacob's grown and gone to California," Lorna explained, as she helped Sarah into her own bath after the girls were settled with bowls of venison stew. "And our Emma—" A shadow crossed her face. "Well, she'd have been about your age. I reckon cholera took her 8 years back. Her things might fit you if you don't mind." "You're very kind," Sarah managed, emotional exhaustion threatening to overcome her as she sank into the first hot water she'd felt in days. Nonsense. Just Christian charity. Lorna set out clean undergarments, a simple blue dress, and soft leather. "Moccasins. Rest now. We'll talk more when you've had sleep." By the time Sarah emerged, clean and dressed in Emma Sullivan's clothes, her daughters were fast asleep in a trundle bed in the corner room. Drake and Sullivan sat at the kitchen table, deep in conversation that halted abruptly when she entered. "Mrs. Calloway," Sullivan acknowledged with a nod. "Drake's been filling me in. Seems you've had a proper ordeal." Sarah sank into the offered chair, accepting a cup of strong coffee from Lorna. "That's one word for it. Harlan's men," Drake picked up the thread. "They need collecting before someone happens by and frees them." Sullivan nodded. "Jackson and Turner rode out 10 minutes ago with the wagon. They'll bring all 3 back for the sheriff when he makes his rounds next week." He turned to Sarah. "As for this Preston fellow and his mining company, burning out a whole town to cover their tracks, that's beyond the pale, even for corporate vultures." "They think they're beyond the law," Sarah said quietly, "and perhaps they are. The territorial judge is in their pocket, from what my husband discovered before he died." "No one's beyond all law," Drake interjected, his voice flat. "Not out here." Sullivan studied him with knowing eyes. "You're fixing to deliver some frontier." "Justice, Drake. I'm fixing to see Mrs. Calloway and her children safely settled first," Drake replied evenly. "Then we'll discuss Preston." "We?" Sarah looked up sharply. Drake met her gaze. "Your husband died exposing their negligence. They burned your home and tried to kill you and your daughters to silence you. That makes it your fight as much as anyone's." A weight Sarah hadn't realized she was carrying seemed to lift slightly from her shoulders. Since Thomas's death, she had fought her battles alone, against the company, against destitution, against a town that turned its back when she asked uncomfortable questions. Having an ally, especially one with Drake's reputation, sparked something she had almost forgotten. Hope. "Drake's right," Sullivan rumbled. "And it ain't just your fight. Milstead's not the first mining camp they've exploited and abandoned. Just the first they've burned wholesale." His meaty fist clenched on the tabletop. "My cousin worked at their Blackstone operation 2 years back. Tunnel collapse killed 14 men. Company called it an act of God and closed the whole operation. Overnight, they're affiliated with Eastern bankers," Drake added. "Money and connections that reach all the way to Washington." "So what can we possibly do?" Sarah asked, frustration edging her voice. Sullivan and Drake exchanged glances. "That," Sullivan said carefully, "depends on what you want, Mrs. Calloway. Justice? Compensation? Revenge?" Sarah considered the question, thinking of her daughters sleeping peacefully in the next room, of Thomas, who had died trying to protect his fellow miners, of the families of Milstead, scattered to the winds. "I want them exposed," she said finally. "I want the world to know what they did, and yes, I want them to pay, not just to me, but to everyone they've wronged." Sullivan nodded approvingly. A righteous aim, harder than simple revenge, but worthier. "Drake said Thomas kept records," Sarah continued, warming to the idea. "Maps of the tunnels showing the unsafe conditions, logs of his reports to management, names of witnesses. He hid them, said they were our insurance policy if anything happened. To him, Her hands twisted in her lap. "I never found them before the fire. I assumed they were lost." Drake leaned forward. Where would he have hidden something like that? Somewhere fireproof if he was smart. A memory stirred in Sarah's mind. Thomas, returning late one night, muddy and tired but satisfied. "The bank," she whispered, then shook her head. "No, not inside it." He didn't trust the bank manager, said Preston had him in his pocket too. "Behind it. There's an old well that was sealed up when they built the bank. Thomas mentioned once that it made a good hiding place." She looked up. "But Milstead is gone. Burned to the ground." "Stone walls don't burn," Drake observed. "Neither do wells. You're suggesting we go back?" Sarah stared at him incredulously. "Not you," Drake clarified. "Me. Once we're sure Harlan and his remaining men are no longer a threat." "The company men will be gone," Sullivan mused. "They think they've erased all evidence. No reason for them to linger." Drake nodded. "If Thomas's records still exist, they're our best leverage. Proof of their negligence, their cover-up. That's worth more than gold to the right people." "And who might those be?" Lorna asked, joining the conversation for the first time as she set a plate of cornbread on the table. "The territorial marshal. In Cheyenne, for one," Drake replied. "Man named Hollister. Incorruptible from what I've seen. Then there's Judge McIntyre in Laramie. No friend to big companies that flout the law. And newspapers," Sarah added, remembering Thomas's words. "He always said if the law wouldn't help, the court of public opinion might." "The Chicago Tribune's been running exposés on corporate malfeasance," Sullivan offered. "Friend of mine, who trades through there, says they're particularly interested in stories of Eastern money exploiting Western resources and lives." For the first time since the fire, Sarah felt the stirrings of purpose beyond mere survival. "So we gather evidence, take it to the law and the press, and make them face consequences. It won't be easy," Drake cautioned. "Men like Preston don't surrender power willingly." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Sarah countered, her chin lifting in determination. The conversation continued late into the night, sketching out plans and contingencies. When Sarah finally retired to the small room where her daughters slept, she felt a strange peace despite all they had endured. There was a path forward now, a purpose beyond day-to-day survival. She watched her daughters sleep, 3 identical, faces relaxed in slumber, safe for the moment at least, and silently renewed the promise she had made at Thomas's grave. She would build a future for them somehow, and she would see justice done. When dawn broke the next morning, Sarah found Drake already awake, cleaning his weapons at the kitchen table with methodical precision. He acknowledged her with a nod, but continued his task, each movement practiced and efficient. "You're leaving," she observed, accepting a cup of coffee from Lorna, who moved quietly around her kitchen. "Tracking Harlan," Drake confirmed without looking up. "He's still out there, still dangerous." "You think he'll come here? After the girls?" Drake considered the question as he reassembled his revolver. "Not likely. He's a predator who preys on the weak and isolated. Sullivan's place is too well defended, and Harlan knows I'm here." He slid the weapon into its holster. "But I don't. Leave loose ends, especially ones that might circle back and threaten those under my protection." The possessive note in his voice, "those under my protection," sent an unexpected warmth through Sarah. She had been alone in her struggles for so long that the simple assertion of alliance was profoundly moving. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, striving to keep her tone neutral. 2 days, 3 at most." Drake finally looked up, his scarred face unreadable. "Sullivan will watch over you and the girls. His place is as safe as any in the territory." Sarah nodded, oddly reluctant. To see him go. In the brief time since he had pulled her from the burning cellar, Drake had transformed from legendary bounty hunter to something else. A guardian, an ally, perhaps even a friend. "The girls will want to say goodbye," she said. A flicker of something, discomfort, Perhaps, crossed Drake's face. Not used to goodbyes, he muttered, especially from children. Despite his apparent unease, when the triplets appeared for breakfast, Drake acknowledged each with grave courtesy, answering their questions about his horse and weapons with surprising patience. To Sarah's astonishment, he produced 3 identical, small wooden carvings from his pocket, crude but recognizable bears. Made these while on watch last night, he explained gruffly when Sarah raised an eyebrow. Something to remember me by until I return. The simple gesture revealed layers to the man that his fearsome reputation had never hinted at. Sarah found herself wondering what else lay beneath the surface of the notorious Raven. As Drake prepared to depart, Sullivan drew him aside for a private word. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, but she noted the serious expressions on both men's faces. When they rejoined the group, Sullivan clapped Drake on the shoulder with enough force to stagger a lesser man. 3 days, Sullivan rumbled. Then we proceed as planned, with or without you. Drake nodded once, adjusting his hat. I'll be back before then. He paused, looking at Sarah. Don't start anything without me. With those parting words, he mounted his freshly acquired horse, a sturdy bay gelding Sullivan had provided to replace, the one Harlan had stolen, and rode out, following the faint tracks that led west into the mountains. The next 2 days passed in a strange limbo for Sarah. Sullivan's trading post offered security and comfort beyond anything she had experienced since Thomas's death. Lorna fussed over the triplets, feeding them until their hollow cheeks began to fill out, teaching them simple tasks in the kitchen and entertaining them with stories of the frontier that somehow managed to be exciting without being frightening. Sarah herself helped in the store, grateful for the chance to repay some small portion of the Sullivans' kindness. The familiar work of measuring flour and coffee, counting out nails and ammunition, and tallying accounts gave her hands purpose while her mind circled restlessly around their plans. On the afternoon of the second day, a rider approached the trading post at a gallop. Sarah, who had been hanging laundry with Lorna, froze at the sound of hoofbeats, her hand instinctively reaching for the children playing nearby. Sullivan emerged from the store, rifle in hand, but lowered it as the rider came into view. "It's Jackson," he announced, recognizing one of the men he had sent to collect Harlan's wounded gang. The rider dismounted in a cloud of dust, his expression grim. "Trouble, Sullivan," he reported breathlessly. "Harlan's free. Ambushed us on the return journey with Preston's men." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Preston? Walter Preston was with Harlan?" Jackson nodded, accepting the canteen Lorna offered. Thick as thieves they were. Preston had at least 8 company men with him, armed to the teeth and asking about survivors from Milstead. He glanced at Sarah. "Asking about a woman and 3 little girls in particular." Sullivan's face darkened. "You weren't followed?" "Took the long way back, covered my trail like Drake taught me, but they're searching the area systematically. Matter of time before they think to check here." Sullivan turned to Sarah. "Get the children inside. Pack only what you need." To Jackson he said, "Saddle fresh horses, 4 of them, and tell Turner to ready the wagon." "We're leaving?" Sarah asked, already gathering the triplets. "You are," Sullivan confirmed. "There's a line shack about 20 miles north in the high country. Defensible position, well stocked, off the main trails. You'll be safe there until Drake returns. And if he doesn't?" Sullivan's expression was grave. "Then Turner will guide you to Cheyenne. I have friends there who can help you disappear if necessary." The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. While the men readied transportation, Lorna helped Sarah pack provisions and necessities for the journey. The triplets, sensing the tension, grew quiet and solemn, their identical blue eyes wide with worry. "Are the bad men coming back, Mama?" Elizabeth asked, as Sarah helped her into a sturdy jacket. Sarah knelt, meeting her daughter's gaze. "Some," Men are looking for us, yes, but Mr. Sullivan is helping us stay safe until Mr. Drake returns. Is Mr. Drake fighting the bad men? Mary asked, clutching the wooden bear he had carved for her. I believe he is, Sarah answered honestly. That's what he does. He protects people from those who would harm them. Catherine, always the most perceptive of the three, studied her mother's face. Are you scared, Mama? Sarah considered the question carefully. I'm concerned, she admitted, but not terrified anymore. Do you know why? When the girls shook their heads, she continued, because we're not alone now. We have friends helping us, and that makes all the difference in the world. The simple truth of her words struck Sarah as she spoke them. For months after Thomas's death, she had faced her struggles in isolation, rebuffed by neighbors who feared the mining company's disapproval. Now, improbably, she had allies willing to risk themselves for her and her children. Drake, the Sullivans, even their hired men. Sullivan appeared in the doorway. Time to move, he announced. Turner spotted. Dust to the south. Riders coming, still a ways off, but heading this direction. Preston? Sarah asked, helping the girls with their small packs. Likely. Too many for a normal trading party. Sullivan's expression was grim. We'll delay them here, send them off on a false trail. Should buy you enough time to reach the line. Jack, I can't ask you to risk yourselves. Sullivan cut her off with a raised hand. You're not asking, Mrs. Calloway. We're offering. Some fights choose us, not the other way around. His weathered face softened slightly. Besides, Drake would skin me alive if I let anything happen to you and those little ones while he was away. Outside, Turner waited with 4 saddled horses. Sarah's heart sank at the sight. While she could ride, getting all 3 5-year-olds safely on horseback through rough country seemed impossible. Sullivan caught her expression and grinned. Lorna thought of that. He gestured to one of the horses, which had been fitted with an ingenious modification to its saddle, a secure basket-like attachment on either side. Indian design, used for carrying papooses, should hold 2 of your girls just fine. The 3rd can ride with Turner. You've thought of everything, Sarah murmured, touched by their thoroughness. Been on this frontier 30 years, ma'am. Planning ahead keeps you alive. Sullivan helped lift the girls into their improvised carriers, securing them with leather straps. Now remember, follow Turner. Stay on the game trails, not the main paths. If you hear riders, go to ground and stay quiet. Line Shack has provisions for 2 weeks. Signals a red cloth hung from the south-facing window, if it's safe for visitors. Sarah mounted her horse, adjusting to the unfamiliar saddle. How will we know when Drake returns? He'll find you, Sullivan said with certainty. Man's the best tracker in 3 territories. As they prepared to depart, Lorna hurried from the trading post with 1 final package. Medicinals, she explained, securing it to Sarah's saddle. Willow bark for pain, feverfew for sickness, comfrey for wounds. Instructions are inside. The women exchanged a brief embrace, and then it was time to go. With Turner in the lead, they set off northward, keeping to the tree line rather than the open trail. The triplets, initially excited by the adventure of riding in their special carriers, soon grew quiet, lulled by the rhythm of the horses. They had been traveling for perhaps an hour when Turner suddenly raised his hand in warning. Riders, he whispered, guiding them deeper into the forest. Coming fast from the east. Sarah's heart pounded as they dismounted and led the horses into a dense thicket of pines. Turner helped her lift the girls from their carriers, placing a finger to his lips to signal silence. The triplets, understanding the gravity of the situation, huddled together without a sound. Through the trees, Sarah could make out a group of horsemen crossing a meadow about a quarter-mile away. They moved with purpose, following a trail that would eventually intersect with the one Sarah and her group had been using. That's Harlan, Turner breathed, pointing to a rider at the group's center. And the one in the city clothes must be Preston. Sarah studied the distant figure. Even from here, she recognized Walter Preston's straight-backed posture and distinctive grey coat. The sight of him brought a surge of anger so intense it nearly took her breath away. This man had ordered her, home burned, had tried to eliminate her family as if they were inconvenient insects, and now hunted them across the wilderness to finish the job. "Why is he so determined to find us?" she whispered. "Milstead is already destroyed. What more does he want?" Turner's expression was grim. "Men like that don't leave witnesses, ma'am, especially ones who know too much." They remained hidden until the riders passed out of sight, continuing toward Sullivan's trading post. Only then did they emerge from cover and resume their journey, now moving with greater urgency. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Turner pushed them harder, clearly hoping to reach shelter before the storm broke. They climbed steadily into more rugged terrain, the forest growing denser around them. "Almost there," Turner announced as they forded a shallow stream. "Line shacks, just beyond that ridge." The structure that appeared as they crested the rise was more substantial than Sarah had expected. Built of heavy logs and nestled against a cliff face, it offered a commanding view of the valley below, while being nearly invisible from most approaches. "Sullivan built this?" Sarah asked, as they dismounted in a small clearing before the cabin. Turner nodded, already helping the tired children from their carriers. Back in his trapping days, built to withstand winter blizzards and summer storms alike. He pointed to a small corral hidden among the trees. "Horses go there, inside stocked with everything you'll need." The interior of the line shack was simple but surprisingly comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, sleeping pallets along one wall, a rough-hewn table and benches, and shelves stocked with provisions. A small side room held firewood, tools, and additional supplies. As Turner lit the lamps and built a fire to ward off the mountain chill, Sarah helped the exhausted triplets change into night clothes. Outside, the promised storm had arrived. Rain, lashing against the sturdy roof. "I'll take first watch," Turner said, checking his rifle. "You and the little ones get some rest." Sarah nodded gratefully, settling her daughters on a pallet near the fire. "How long will you stay? Until Drake comes for you, or Sullivan sends word it's safe to return?" Turner positioned himself near a window that overlooked the approach to the cabin. "Try not to worry, Mrs. Calloway. The Raven's reputation ain't exaggerated. If anyone can put an end to Preston and his schemes, it's him." As her daughters drifted off to sleep, Sarah stared into the dancing flames of the fireplace, turning Turner's words over in her mind. She had placed her faith in Elijah Drake, a man she barely knew, whose fearsome reputation suggested violence and danger rather than protection. Yet something about him had earned her trust, perhaps the gentle way he had dealt with her frightened daughters, or the unwavering determination with which he had pulled her from the burning cellar. Outside, lightning illuminated the mountains in brief, ghostly flashes. Each thunderclap seemed to echo Drake's parting words, "Don't start anything without me." Sarah closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claiming her. Her last conscious thought was a fervent hope that wherever Drake was, whatever battle he was fighting, he would return to them as promised. For somewhere along their desperate journey, the fearsome bounty hunter had become something unexpected, their best hope for justice and perhaps for a future. The storm that had escorted them to the line shack raged throughout the night, wind howling down from the mountain peaks like hungry wolves. Sarah woke at dawn to find Turner still at his post by the window, rifle across his knees, gaze steady on the trail below. "Any sign of trouble?" she asked quietly, careful not to wake the triplets still slumbering on their pallet. Turner shook his head. "Storm would have covered our tracks. Even Harlan isn't fool enough to track in weather like that." He stood, stretching, muscles stiff from the night's vigil. "I'll check the horses. Left alone, Sarah took stock of their sanctuary. The line shack was more thoroughly provisioned than she'd realized the night before. Shelves stocked with preserved foods, ammunition, medical supplies, even books and playing cards for long winter evenings. Sullivan had clearly designed it as both refuge and fortress. She found a cast-iron stove in the corner and set about preparing breakfast, taking comfort in the familiar routine. By the time Turner returned, the aroma of coffee and frying bacon had roused the triplets, who sat at the rough-hewn table rubbing sleep from identical blue eyes. "Horses are fine," Turner reported, accepting a steaming cup gratefully. "Storm's blown over, clear day, which means good visibility, but also means we can be spotted if anyone comes looking." Sarah nodded, serving portions of bacon and hardtack to her daughters. "How long do you think we'll need to stay here?" Turner considered. "Depends on Drake, and on whether Preston and Harlan give up their search." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Sullivan will send word when it's safe. One way or another." The day passed slowly, the confines of the line shack beginning to chafe despite its relative comfort. The triplets, accustomed to the space of their home in Milstead and the freedom to play outdoors, grew restless by mid-afternoon. "Can we go outside, Mama? Just for a little while?" Mary pleaded, pressing her face against the window glass. Sarah looked to Turner, who had been inventorying supplies in the side room. He frowned, considering the request. "There's a small clearing behind the cabin," he said finally. "Can't be seen from below. Might be safe enough for a short spell if we're careful." The girls' faces lit with excitement at this concession. Sarah helped them into their coats and boots while Turner scouted the area, returning only when satisfied. It was secure. "Stay within sight of the back door," Sarah instructed firmly, "and come running if Mr. Turner or I call you." The joy on their faces as they tumbled into the fresh mountain air was worth the risk, Sarah decided. She watched from the doorway as they discovered pine cones, interesting stones, and a family of squirrels chattering in a nearby tree. Their identical figures in their borrowed clothes, too large and rolled at sleeves and ankles, reminded her painfully of Thomas. He had delighted in their sameness, while Sarah had always been careful to nurture their individual spirits. "He'd be proud of them," Turner remarked, correctly interpreting her expression. "Brave little things. They've had to be." Sarah sighed. "I sometimes wonder if I've done right by them, staying in Milstead after Thomas died, pursuing questions about the mine collapse when everyone told me to let it go." "Truth's always worth pursuing," Turner said simply. "Your husband knew that. Now your girls know it too." Sarah was about to respond when Turner suddenly stiffened, his hand moving to his revolver. In the same instant, the triplets froze in their play, heads tilted like young deer sensing danger. "Inside," Turner mouthed to Sarah, who immediately beckoned the girls with urgent gestures. They scampered silently to her side, years of frontier life having taught them the value of swift, quiet obedience in moments of potential danger. Sarah hurried them through the door, heart pounding as Turner eased it shut behind them. "What is it?" she whispered. "Someone's coming, single rider from the west." Turner moved to the front window, peering through a narrow gap in the shutters. Keeping to cover, moving careful-like. Sarah gathered the girls close, mind racing through. Possibilities. Sullivan sending news, Preston's men finding them despite the storm, or perhaps "It's Drake," Turner announced, relief evident in his voice. "Looking worse for wear, but alive." Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had been counting on the bounty hunter's return, how central he had become to her hopes for her daughter's safety and future. Turner unbarred the door as Drake approached, leading his horse the final few yards to avoid leaving an obvious trail. The bounty hunter's appearance confirmed Turner's assessment. His clothes were torn and mud-splattered, a crude bandage wrapped around his left forearm, his face more haggard than when he'd left Sullivan's trading post. "Mr. Drake!" The triplets chorused, rushing forward despite Sarah's attempt to hold them back. To her surprise, Drake acknowledged each child with a nod, even allowing Mary to take his hand as he entered the cabin. "You've been keeping watch, I see," he said gravely to the little girl. "Good work." "We were very quiet," Elizabeth assured him earnestly. "I knew you would be." Drake relinquished his rifle to Turner and lowered himself onto a bench, fatigue evident in every movement. "You're hurt," Sarah observed, already moving to retrieve Lorna's medical supplies. Drake dismissed this with a wave. Scratch had worse shaving. Despite his nonchalance, he didn't resist when Sarah insisted on examining the wound, a deep gash that had clearly come from a knife rather than a branch. "Harlan?" she asked quietly as she cleaned the injury, sending the curious triplets to help Turner with Drake's horse. Drake nodded once. "He won't trouble anyone again." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Sarah had no illusions about what it meant. The notorious bounty hunter hadn't tracked Harlan to arrest him. "Did he suffer?" she asked, surprised at her own question. Drake's eyes met hers, searching for the motivation behind her words. "No more than necessary," he answered finally. "He had information I needed." Sarah applied a fresh bandage, considering this. She had never thought of herself as someone who could wish pain on another human being, but the memory of her daughter's terror as they were held captive made her less certain of her own capacity for mercy. "What information?" "Preston's next move, the company's plans." Drake winced slightly as she tied off the bandage. "They're meeting tomorrow at the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. Preston, his father, and the company's eastern investors, reviewing the Milstead operations closure and planning their next venture." "They've already moved on," Sarah said bitterly. "As if lives weren't destroyed, as if my husband and 11 other men didn't die in their mines." "They've moved on," Drake agreed. "But we haven't." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "This is why Harlan was working with Preston. It's a contract, hired muscle, to eliminate any survivors who might testify about Milstead's deliberate burning." Sarah stared at the document, Preston's elegant signature clearly visible at the bottom. "This is evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, among other crimes." Drake accepted a cup of coffee from Turner, who had returned from settling the horse. "Between this and whatever records your husband hid, we might have enough to move against them." "If the records still exist," Sarah cautioned, "if they weren't destroyed in the fire." "Only one way to find out." Drake's expression hardened. "We need to return to Milstead." Turner, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "You're proposing to walk into a burned-out ghost town that might still be watched by Preston's men, to search for documents that might not have survived, based on a hiding place that might not be findable?" "That about sums it up," Drake acknowledged, with a grim smile. To Sarah's surprise, Turner grinned back. "Sounds like a Drake plan, all right. When do we leave?" "First light tomorrow." Drake turned to Sarah. "You'll stay here with your daughters. Safer." Sarah straightened, meeting his gaze steadily. "No, Mrs. Calloway. It's my husband's evidence," she interrupted. "His maps, his documentation of their negligence. I'm the one who knows what to look for, what matters." Her voice softened slightly. "Besides, I'm the only one who can identify the exact location of the old well behind the bank. Thomas only showed me once." Drake studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded once. "The children can remain here with Turner," Sarah proposed, glancing at the man for confirmation. Turner nodded. "Line shack's defensible. I can watch over them until you return." "No." Catherine's small voice came from the doorway, where the triplets had reappeared. "We want to stay with Mama. Sarah knelt to her daughter's level, gathering them close. "This is something Mama needs to do to make us safe, to get justice for Papa. Mr. Turner will take good care of you, and will be back before you know it." "Promise?" Elizabeth's lower lip trembled. "I promise." Sarah kissed each forehead in turn. "And have I ever broken a promise to you?" The girls shook their heads solemnly. "When would we leave?" Sarah asked, returning her attention to Drake. "Dawn," he repeated. "It's a day's hard ride to Milstead if we push. We find the documents if they exist, then continue straight to Cheyenne to intercept Preston at the bank meeting." "And then?" Drake's scarred face showed the first real smile she had seen from him, a predator's smile, cold and determined. "Then we introduce a complication to their business plans." That evening, as they prepared for the journey ahead, Drake revealed more of what he had learned during his pursuit of Harlan. The outlaw had been more forthcoming than expected once cornered, perhaps hoping information might purchase leniency. "Preston's father is retiring," Drake explained as they inventoried supplies by lamplight, handing control of the company to Walter. "The meeting in Cheyenne is part ceremony, part business, presenting the new leadership to the Eastern investors, securing funding for their next operation." "Which is?" Sarah asked, rolling spare bandages for their packs. "Mining operation in the Bitterroot Mountains. They've already begun quietly buying claims, pressuring small operators to sell." Drake checked the loads in his spare revolver before stowing it. "Same pattern as Milstead. They'll extract what wealth they can with minimal safety measures, then abandon it when the easy profits are gone." Sarah's hands stilled. "Unless they're stopped." "Unless they're stopped," Drake agreed. "Judge McIntyre will be in Cheyenne as well. If your husband's evidence is compelling enough, combined with Harlan's contract and our testimony about the burning of Milstead, it could end them," Sarah finished, a fierce hope kindling within her. Drake's expression remained cautious. "It would damage them, certainly. Companies like theirs have deep pockets and powerful friends, but at minimum, it would force them to compensate Milstead's displaced families, maybe save lives in their future operations." It was more than Sarah had dared hope for since Thomas's death. Not just personal vengeance, but justice for all of Milstead. Protection for future mining communities that might otherwise suffer similar fates. After the triplets were settled for the night, with promises extracted from both adults that they would say goodbye before departing in the morning, Sarah joined Drake outside on the small porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Thank you," she said simply, wrapping her shawl tighter against the mountain chill. Drake glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "For what, exactly?" "For coming back. For helping us when you could have ridden away." Sarah studied his profile in the darkness. "For caring about what happens to us." Drake was silent for a long moment, his face turned toward the distant peaks. "Had a family once," he finally said, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear. "Wife, son, in a mining town, not unlike Milstead." Sarah held her breath, sensing the rarity of this confidence. "Cave-in. Company claimed it was unpredictable, natural disaster." His hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his face. "I was one of the rescue workers, dug for 3 days straight, found 13 bodies. My boy was among them." "And your wife?" Sarah asked gently. "Typhoid, 6 months later. Care was expensive. Company doctor wouldn't treat families of troublemakers." The word emerged as a curse. "I'd been asking questions about the collapse, like your husband." Understanding dawned. "That's why you helped us. Why are you willing to risk yourself against Preston and his company?" Drake turned to face her directly. "I couldn't save my family, couldn't get justice for them either. I was just one man, grieving and angry, easy to dismiss as a lunatic." His eyes held hers. "But this time it's different. Your husband was smarter than I was. He gathered evidence, created a record, and you're stronger than my Caroline was. You survived, kept fighting. The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep within Sarah. This man, feared throughout the territories as a ruthless hunter of men, was driven not by bloodlust, but by a profound loss that mirrored her own. "What was your son's name?" She asked softly. "James." For an instant, the hardness in Drake's face gave way to something softer, more vulnerable. "He'd be about 15 now." Sarah reached out impulsively, covering his scarred hand with her own. "We'll make it count this time. For James, for Thomas, for all of them." Drake didn't pull away from her touch. After a moment, he nodded once. "Get some rest, Mrs. Calloway. Long day ahead tomorrow." They departed at first light, as promised, after emotional goodbyes with the triplets. Drake had explained their route carefully to Turner, including signals and rendezvous points should anything go wrong. "If we're not back within 4 days, or if you don't receive word from Sullivan, take the girls to Cheyenne," Drake instructed. "Ask for Marshal Hollister, no one else." Turner nodded grimly. 4 days, then we move." Sarah's heart ached as she embraced each daughter in turn, wiping away tears and promising a swift return. The girls had already endured so much loss and disruption in their young lives. Leaving them again, even temporarily, felt like tearing open a wound that had barely begun to heal. "Be brave for Mama," she whispered to Catherine, the most sensitive of the three. "Help Mr. Turner with your sisters." "I will," Catherine promised solemnly. "And you be brave too, Mama." The journey to Milstead was grueling, as Drake had predicted. They kept to game trails and obscure paths, avoiding the main roads where Preston's men might be watching. The terrain grew increasingly familiar to Sarah as they approached what had been her home for the past 7 years. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge that offered a clear view of the valley below and the blackened ruins of Milstead. Even prepared for the sight, Sarah gasped at the devastation. Where a bustling mining town had stood just days before, only charred timbers and collapsed walls remained, stark against the landscape like a wound. "It's completely gone," she whispered, grief tightening her throat. Drake studied the scene through his spyglass. Stone structures still standing, bank, company office, church. He scanned methodically. No movement. Appears deserted. They approached, cautiously nonetheless, circling wide to enter from the east, where a stand of pines offered cover almost to the town's edge. Drake insisted they leave the horses hidden and proceed on foot for the final approach, his experienced eyes constantly scanning for any sign of watchers or ambush. The smell hit Sarah first as they entered what had been Milstead's main street. Acrid. Smoke, still rising from some deep burning embers, mixed with the sickly sweet odor of things that should never burn. The utter silence was unnerving after the normal bustle of a mining town. No hammering from the blacksmith's forge, no piano from the saloon, no children's voices from the small schoolhouse. "This way," Sarah murmured, leading Drake toward what remained of the bank, a stone structure whose roof had burned away, but whose walls still stood defiantly. The well was behind it, near the south corner. They picked their way through debris, alert for any sound of movement. The bank's interior was a gutted shell, the safe standing open and empty amidst the ruins. Company men took whatever valuables remained, Drake observed, examining the safe's condition. Professional job. Sarah barely heard him, focused on finding the external landmark Thomas had shown her. Behind the bank, a small courtyard that had once held a kitchen garden was now a wasteland of ash and debris. She oriented herself using the building's cornerstone, then began to count paces, as Thomas had instructed. 8 paces south from the cornerstone, she muttered, then 12 east toward the old oak. The oak was gone, burned to a skeletal trunk, but the distance was right. Sarah knelt, brushing aside ash and charred wood to reveal flat stones arranged in a circle, the sealed top of the old well. "Here," she called softly to Drake, who had been standing guard at the courtyard entrance. Together, they cleared debris from the well cover. The stones were mortared together, forming a solid cap that wouldn't easily be moved. "Your husband hid documents under this?" Drake asked skeptically, testing the weight of the center stone. "No, inside the well shaft. There's a cavity in the wall about 4 feet down." Sarah ran her fingers along the mortar lines. Thomas said one section of the cap was designed to be removed, a smaller stone. Her fingers found what she sought, a stone roughly the size of a dinner plate, set within the larger cap, but with fresher mortar around its edges. "This one." Drake produced a knife and began carefully chipping away the mortar. After several minutes of painstaking work, the stone loosened enough to be pried upward, revealing a dark opening about 18 inches across, the original well access, sealed when the town installed its water pump years earlier. Sarah peered into the darkness. "We need light." Drake nodded, returning to the bank's interior. He returned moments later with a partially burned board, one end wrapped in fabric, torn from what might have been a banker's curtain. Using flint and steel from his pack, he lit the makeshift torch. "I'll go down," he offered, already securing a rope around his waist. Sarah shook her head. "I know exactly where to look. Thomas showed me the hiding place specifically in case something happened to him." She held out her hands for the torch. "I'll be quick." After a moment's hesitation, Drake handed over the torch and helped secure the rope around her. "Test each handhold before you put your weight on it," he instructed. "Those stones could be loose after all these years." The descent into the well was easier than Sarah had feared. The old construction included iron rungs embedded in the stone wall, most still solid despite years of disuse. The air grew cooler and damper as she descended, the torch casting dancing shadows against the circular stone walls. 4 feet down, just as Thomas had described, she found it, an irregular stone that protruded slightly from the otherwise smooth wall. Setting the torch in a convenient crack, Sarah pressed the stone as Thomas had demonstrated. With a grating sound, the stone pivoted inward, revealing a cavity behind. Heart pounding with hope and fear, Sarah reached inside. Her fingers touched oilcloth. Thomas had wrapped the documents to protect them from the well's moisture. She withdrew the package, about the size of a small book, and tucked it securely inside her jacket. "Found it," she called up to Drake, relief flooding through her. His face appeared as a silhouette against the sky above. "Anything else in there?" Sarah directed the torch back into the cavity, revealing something metallic at the back. Reaching in again, she extracted a small tin box, unexpectedly heavy for its size. This, too, she secured inside her clothing before beginning the climb back to the surface. Drake helped her from the well opening, immediately scanning their surroundings before turning his attention to her discoveries. "What did you find?" Sarah unwrapped the oilcloth package first, revealing a leather-bound journal and several folded maps. Thomas's record of the unsafe conditions, his reports to management, copies of letters he sent to the territorial inspector, statements from the miners who witnessed problems. She opened the journal reverently, recognizing her husband's precise handwriting. "And the box?" Drake prompted. Sarah worked the clasp open, then gasped. Inside lay dozens of gold coins and several small but brilliant uncut diamonds. A folded note in Thomas's handwriting explained, "Evidence payment from Jenkins, Edison, and Miller. Conscience money for their silence after the first collapse. Use only if all else fails." He was building a case, Sarah whispered, understanding dawning. Not just documenting problems, but actual corruption, bribes to ignore safety issues. Drake examined one of the maps, his expression growing more satisfied by the moment. "This is exactly what we need." Tunnel schematics showing where support. Beams were needed but not installed. Annotations about water seepage, unstable sections. He looked up at Sarah, true respect in his eyes. "Your husband wasn't just a conscientious foreman. He was methodically documenting criminal negligence." "Will it be enough?" Sarah asked, carefully rewrapping the precious evidence. Drake nodded slowly. "With Harlan's contract proving Preston's willingness to murder witnesses, these documents showing deliberate negligence leading to deaths, and our testimony about the burning of Milstead." His scarred face showed grim satisfaction. "Yes, Mrs. Calloway, I believe it will be enough." As they carefully resealed the well and prepared to depart, Sarah took a final look at the ruins of what had been her home. Somewhere beneath that ash and debris lay the life she and Thomas had built together, the memories of happier days, all reduced to char and dust by Preston's greed and cruelty. "We'll make it right, Thomas," she whispered, clutching the evidence he had died to compile. "I promise you that." Drake, already scanning their planned route out of town, paused at her words. "We should move," he said not unkindly. "We have what we came for, and Cheyenne is still a day's ride away." Sarah nodded, tucking away her grief for another time. The past was ashes, but the future, her daughter's future, remained to be secured. With Thomas's evidence and Drake's determination, perhaps justice was finally within reach. As they retreated through the skeletal remains of Milstead, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For months she had been haunted by questions. Where was Thomas's evidence? Would it ever be found? Could his death and those of his fellow miners ever be avenged? Now, with each step away from the burned town, those questions were replaced by a growing resolve. Preston and his company would face consequences. The families of Milstead would receive justice. And somehow, somewhere, Sarah and her daughters would build a new life from the ashes of the old. Beside her, Drake moved with renewed purpose, his habitual vigilance tempered now with something she recognized as hope. This mission had become personal for him too, a chance to right old wrongs, to deliver the justice that had eluded him after his own family's tragedy. They reached their horses without incident and mounted swiftly, eager to put distance between themselves and the ghost town before nightfall. As they rode away, Sarah did not look back. Milstead belonged to the past now. Cheyenne and the confrontation that awaited them there was the future. Cheyenne emerged from the horizon like a mirage, first the church steeples, then the larger buildings of Wyoming's territorial capital rising from the prairie. After days in the wilderness, the sight of civilization struck Sarah as both welcoming and threatening. Here, finally, they would confront Preston and his powerful allies, armed with nothing but truth and determination. "We'll need to move carefully," Drake cautioned as they approached the city outskirts. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt road leading into town. "Preston's family has influence here. We can't simply walk into the territorial bank and make accusations." "Where do we start then?" Sarah asked, adjusting her borrowed clothes. Lorna Sullivan's dress, though clean and serviceable, marked her as a frontier woman rather than a city resident. "Judge McIntyre first," Drake decided. "He's staying at the Cheyenne Hotel. If he finds the evidence compelling, he can issue the necessary warrants before the bank meeting this afternoon." They entered Cheyenne from the north, avoiding the busier main streets. The city had grown remarkably since Sarah's last visit 3 years earlier. New buildings lined the streets, the railroad station bustled with activity, and well-dressed men and women moved purposefully along wooden sidewalks. Drake led them to a modest boarding house on a quiet side street. "We'll secure rooms here," he explained. "The owner, Mrs. Wilkins, is discreet. No questions asked, no information shared with curious parties." The boarding house proved as unremarkable as promised, clean but spare, with a landlady whose only interest seemed to be their ability to pay in advance. Sarah gratefully accepted the small room, with its narrow bed and washstand, the simple comforts luxurious after days on the trail. "1 hour," Drake instructed as they parted in the hallway. "Clean up, rest if you can. I'll return with fresh clothes more suitable for visiting a judge. Left alone, Sarah unwrapped Thomas's evidence and spread it carefully on the bed. The journal contained exactly what Drake had hoped: detailed records of unsafe conditions, ignored, warnings, and finally, proof of bribes paid to silence witnesses after earlier accidents. The accompanying maps documented the precise locations where support beams had been inadequate or missing entirely, with Thomas's neat annotations noting the company's awareness of these issues. The gold coins and uncut diamonds remained in their tin box, tangible evidence of the corruption Thomas had uncovered. Sarah ran her fingers over her husband's handwriting, a wave of grief washing over her. He had known the risks he was taking, had prepared this evidence knowing it might be needed after his death. "You were right all along," she whispered to his memory. "And today, finally, someone will listen." Drake returned as promised, carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "From Mrs. Wilkins's daughter," he explained, handing it to Sarah. "About your size," she thought. The package contained a navy blue dress of modest but respectable cut, along with appropriate undergarments and a straw bonnet trimmed with matching ribbon. Sarah changed quickly, grateful for clothing that wouldn't immediately mark her as an outsider in Cheyenne society. When she emerged from her room, she found Drake similarly transformed. Gone were the trail-worn clothes of the bounty hunter, replaced by a clean black suit and white shirt. His hair was combed, his face freshly shaved except for a neat mustache. Only the scar on his face and the watchful eyes remained unchanged. "You clean up well, Mr. Drake," Sarah observed, surprised by the transformation. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Appearances matter in cities, even though I know that much." He offered his arm with unexpected formality. "Shall we, Mrs. Calloway?" The Cheyenne Hotel stood as the crowning jewel of the city, 4 stories of red brick and white trim, with a columned entrance where uniformed doormen assisted guests from carriages. Drake approached with the confidence of a businessman rather than a frontier bounty hunter, requesting an audience with Judge McIntyre with practiced ease. "The judge is taking his breakfast in the private dining room," the desk clerk informed them after consulting a leather-bound register. "He has a meeting in 30 minutes, but I can inquire if he would see you briefly before then." "Please tell him it concerns the Milstead Mining Company and Walter Preston," Drake replied, slipping the man a coin. "Most urgent." They waited in the hotel's elegant lobby, Sarah clutching her reticule, which contained Thomas's journal and the most crucial maps. The remainder of the evidence remained secured at the boarding house, too bulky to carry discreetly. After 10 minutes that stretched like hours, the clerk returned. "Judge McIntyre will see you now. Please follow me." The private dining room was paneled in dark wood, a single table set near tall windows overlooking Cheyenne's main avenue. Judge Alden McIntyre proved to be a lean, silver-haired man with piercing grey eyes, and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent years in Wyoming's harsh climate before ascending to the bench. "Mr. Drake," he acknowledged with a nod, setting aside his coffee cup. "Your reputation precedes you, and this is Mrs. Sarah Calloway, Your Honor," Drake introduced her, widow of Thomas Calloway, who was shift foreman at the Milstead mine before its collapse killed him and 11 others. The judge's expression remained neutral as he gestured for them to sit. "I've heard about Milstead's unfortunate burning. Tragic loss for the territory." He studied Sarah more carefully. "You survived the fire, Mrs. Calloway?" "Barely, Your Honor. My 3 daughters and I were deliberately left to burn when the company evacuated the town." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "They tried to murder us to prevent the truth about the mine collapse from emerging." Judge McIntyre's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a serious accusation against a prominent territorial business." "With evidence to support it," Drake interjected, nodding to Sarah. She withdrew Thomas's journal and placed it before the judge. "My husband documented the unsafe conditions, the ignored warnings, the bribes paid to silence witnesses after earlier accidents. He knew the company was endangering lives for profit, and he died trying to prevent more deaths. The judge opened the journal, scanning its contents with practiced efficiency. His expression remained impassive, but Sarah noted how his fingers lingered on certain pages, how his breathing changed subtly when he reached the documentation of bribes. "And you can verify this is your husband's handwriting?" he asked without looking up. "Yes, Your Honor. Those are his maps, his calculations, his observations of conditions that the company deliberately concealed from inspectors." Judge McIntyre closed the journal and sat back, studying them both. "You realize the Prestons are among the territory's most influential families? Their mining operations employ hundreds. Their taxes fund schools, roads, and government offices. They also killed 13 men through negligence, then burned an entire town to conceal evidence," Drake replied evenly. "With respect, Your Honor, the law should apply equally to all, regardless of wealth or influence." The judge's stern face revealed nothing of his thoughts as he tapped the journal with one finger. "What exactly are you asking of me, Mr. Drake?" "Warrant to arrest Walter Preston on charges of conspiracy to commit murder based on this contract." Drake produced Harlan's document from his coat. "And authorization to seize company records during today's meeting at the Territorial Bank before they can be destroyed or altered." Judge McIntyre examined the contract, his frown deepening. "This is Harlan's signature? The outlaw?" "It is," Drake confirmed. "He confessed before his death that Preston hired him specifically to eliminate Mrs. Calloway and her daughters as witnesses." "And where is Harlan now?" the judge asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Dead," Drake said, simply resisting capture. The judge nodded, unsurprised. He returned his attention to Sarah. "Mrs. Calloway, do you have further evidence beyond this journal and contract? Maps showing exactly where support beams were omitted, despite known dangers. Financial records of bribes paid. Physical evidence in the form of gold and diamonds given to buy silence." Sarah leaned forward. "And 3 surviving mine workers. Who will testify to conditions if given protection from company retaliation?" This last piece of information was new to Drake, who glanced at her with surprise. Sarah had not mentioned these potential witnesses during their journey. Thomas didn't. "Only document problems," she explained to both men. He identified allies, miners who saw the dangers but feared for their jobs if they spoke out. "After his death, they helped me continue gathering evidence. They're scattered now, but can be reached if necessary." Judge McIntyre considered all. This information silently, his judicial training evident in his measured demeanor. Finally, he rose and moved to the window, gazing out at Cheyenne's busy street. "The Territorial Court has received complaints about Preston mining before," he said quietly. "Injuries, deaths, environmental damage, but never with evidence substantial enough to overcome their legal team's objections." He turned back to face them. "This documentation, if verifiable, changes that calculation." Hope flickered in Sarah's. "Just, then you'll help us? I'll issue a limited warrant," the judge decided, "authorizing Marshal Hollister to accompany you to this afternoon's bank meeting and seize relevant company records if, and only if, they corroborate your evidence of criminal negligence and conspiracy." It wasn't everything they had hoped for, but it was a start. Sarah and Drake exchanged glances, silently agreeing to accept this compromise. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah said with genuine gratitude. "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Calloway." Judge McIntyre's expression was grave. "You're challenging powerful men who believe themselves untouchable. They won't surrender easily, even to the law." His gaze shifted to Drake. "I assume you'll ensure Mrs. Calloway's safety throughout this process?" Drake nodded once. "With my life, if necessary." Let's hope it doesn't come to that. The judge returned to his desk and quickly wrote out the warrant, signing and sealing it officially. Present this to Marshal Hollister. He's a good man, incorruptible. He'll execute it properly. As they prepared to leave, Judge McIntyre addressed Sarah directly. Mrs. Calloway, may I ask, what do you hope to achieve beyond justice for your husband? Sarah considered the question carefully. Safety for other mining families, compensation for those displaced by the burning of Milstead, and a future for my daughters, where powerful men cannot simply erase lives when they become inconvenient. The judge nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. Then I wish you success. The territory needs more citizens with your courage. The territorial marshal's office occupied a solid brick building near the courthouse. Marshal James Hollister proved to be a barrel-chested man with a walrus mustache and calm, assessing eyes that missed nothing. He read the judge's warrant twice, before looking up at Drake, whom he evidently knew. The raven-hunting corporate wolves now? He asked with a raised eyebrow. That's new territory for you. Justice is justice, Drake replied simply, regardless of the target. Hollister studied Sarah next. Mrs. Calloway, I knew your husband by reputation. Honest man. Too honest for his own good in Preston's operation. His expression softened slightly. I'm sorry for your loss, and still about Milstead's destruction. Then help us hold those responsible accountable, Sarah urged. The marshal tapped the warrant thoughtfully. This is thin ice we're treading. Preston's father sits on the territorial commission. Walter has friends in the governor's office. Do those friendships place them above the law? Drake challenged. No, Hollister admitted, but they do complicate enforcement. He sighed, tucking the warrant into his vest. The bank meeting is at 3 o'clock. I'll meet you at the side entrance at 1:45. We'll observe first, intervene. Only if I see clear evidence supporting these allegations. It was as much as they could hope for under the circumstances. As they departed, Hollister called after Drake. Watch your back, Raven. Preston fights dirty. You've already seen that, and he doesn't like losing. They used the remaining hours to prepare. Drake insisted they return to the boarding house and recover all of Thomas's evidence, securing it in a leather portfolio. They then visited a notary to make certified copies of the most damning documents, insurance in case the originals were somehow lost or destroyed. We should check on the triplets, Sarah suggested as midday approached. Send word that we're safe, that we've found the evidence. Drake agreed, arranging for a telegraph message to be sent to Sullivan's trading post. Evidence secured. All lahai. Well, proceeding as planned. The reply came back within the hour. Children safe. Sullivan sends reinforcements. Good hunting. Sarah smiled at the cryptic message. Reinforcements. Sullivan has friends in Cheyenne, Drake explained. Former trappers, scouts, frontiersmen who've settled here. Honest men who owe him favors. He checked his pocket watch. They'll be watching the bank, making sure Preston doesn't have men waiting to ambush us afterward. As 3 o'clock approached, they made their way toward the territorial bank, an imposing granite structure with classical columns and heavy oak doors. From across the street, they observed expensively dressed men arriving in carriages, gathering for what appeared to be a significant meeting. Preston Sr., Drake murmured, indicating a distinguished grey-haired man descending from the first carriage. And there's Walter. The younger Preston followed his father, dressed impeccably in an Eastern-cut suit, his bearing confident and arrogant. Marshal Hollister appeared precisely as promised, approaching from a side street with 2 deputies. 8 men inside already, he reported quietly. Preston Sr. and Jr., 3 Eastern investors, the bank president, and 2 company lawyers. He patted his coat where the warrant rested. Remember, we observe first. Move only on my signal. They entered through the bank's side entrance, Hollister's badge, ensuring no questions from the guard posted there. The meeting was taking place in the bank's private conference room, a wood-paneled chamber with tall windows and a massive oak table where the participants were already seated. The marshal positioned them in an adjoining office, where a partially open connecting door allowed them to observe and listen undetected. Walter Preston stood at the head of the table, addressing the assembled men with practiced charm. "Gentlemen, the Milstead operation has concluded exactly as projected," he announced. "The easily accessible ore bodies were extracted at optimal cost, and the site closure was executed efficiently." "Efficiently?" One of the Eastern investors frowned. "Reports mentioned a fire destroying the entire town. That seems rather extreme, even by frontier standards." Walter's smile never wavered. "An unfortunate accident, but not without its benefits. The insurance payment for company buildings exceeds their depreciated value, and the site cleanup costs are now negligible." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at the casual dismissal of an entire community's destruction. Drake placed a steadying hand on her arm, silently urging patience. "What of the documented safety concerns?" another investor asked. "I received an anonymous letter mentioning unsafe conditions before the mine collapse last fall." Preston Sr. interjected smoothly. "Disgruntled former employees spreading falsehoods, nothing more. Our safety record, properly documented, meets all territorial requirements." "More than meets them," Walter added, opening a leather portfolio disturbingly similar to the one containing Thomas's evidence. "I've brought the official inspection reports for your review. You'll see every shaft was properly supported, every safety measure implemented according to regulations." As he distributed documents around the table, Sarah could contain herself no longer. "Those reports are forgeries," she declared, stepping into the doorway. The room fell silent as every head turned toward her. Walter Preston's confident expression faltered for an instant before hardening into cold fury. "This is a private meeting," the bank president sputtered. "How dare you intrude?" Marshal Hollister stepped forward, badge prominently displayed. "Official investigation, gentlemen. Please remain seated." He nodded to Sarah. "You were saying about forgeries, Mrs. Calloway?" Sarah moved to the table, Drake close behind her. "Those inspection reports show safety measures that never existed. I have my husband's original documentation proving that support beams were deliberately omitted despite known dangers, that warnings were ignored, and that bribes were paid to cover up earlier accidents." She opened Thomas's portfolio, placing his maps alongside the company's doctored versions. The differences were immediately apparent even to untrained eyes. Entire sections of support structures shown on the company maps were absent from Thomas's. Meticulous drawings. "This woman is clearly delusional with grief," Walter Preston declared, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Her husband died in the collapse. She's been making wild accusations for months. Wild enough that you hired Harlan and his men to eliminate her and her children when you burned Milstead?" Drake asked quietly, placing the contract on the table. "This document says otherwise." Preston Sr. examined the contract, his face paling. "Walter? What is this?" "A forgery," his son snapped. "Obviously manufactured by this woman and her associate." He gestured dismissively toward Drake. "This bounty hunter probably wrote it himself. And did he also write these?" Sarah produced the journal and additional maps. "My husband's daily records spanning 3 years, documenting every safety violation, every warning ignored, every accident concealed from territorial authorities." The Eastern investors exchanged troubled glances, one of them reaching for Thomas's journal with evident concern. "These meetings were recorded in company minutes," he noted, pointing to a specific entry. "But the outcomes documented here are very different from what we were told." "Enough of this farce," Walter declared, starting toward the door. "Father, we should continue this discussion with our attorneys present." Marshal Hollister stepped into his path. "Not so fast, Mr. Preston. I have a warrant authorized by Judge McIntyre to seize company records relevant to mining safety violations and the circumstances surrounding Milstead's destruction." "This is outrageous," Preston Sr. blustered. "Do you know who we are? The governor himself is subject to the same laws as every citizen," the marshal interrupted firmly. "As are you, sir." What happened next occurred with such speed that Sarah barely had time to register the danger. Walter Preston, seeing his carefully constructed world collapsing around him, lunged toward her with murderous intent. His hand emerged from his jacket, clutching a small Derringer pistol. "You should have died in that fire," he snarled, raising the weapon. Drake moved with the practiced reflexes of a man accustomed to violence, placing himself between Sarah and the gun. But before either man could act further, a shot rang out, not from Preston's Derringer, but from behind them. Preston staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as his unfired weapon clattered to the floor. In the doorway stood a figure Sarah had not expected to see again so soon. Sullivan, rifle still raised from the precise shot that had disabled Preston without killing him. "Meeting's over," the trading post owner announced calmly. "Marshal, I believe you'll find Mr. Preston's wound is not fatal, merely educational." What followed seemed to unfold with dreamlike quality. Deputies securing Walter Preston despite his father's blustering threats. Marshal Hollister methodically collecting and documenting both sets of records. The Eastern investors withdrawing to confer among themselves, their expressions grave with the realization of what had been done in their names. "You came," Sarah said to Sullivan when she finally found her voice. "Got your telegraph. Figured you might need an extra gun." Sullivan shrugged, as if his timely arrival were the most natural thing in the world. "Turner and the girls are at my cousin's house here in town. Thought you might want to see them. They're here in Cheyenne." Sarah's heart leapt at the prospect of reuniting with her daughters. Sullivan nodded. "Rode last night. Safe and sound, though mighty anxious to see their mama." As the official proceedings continued around them, Drake touched Sarah's arm lightly. "Go to your daughters," he urged. "The marshal has what he needs now. This part is just paperwork and legal formalities." Sarah hesitated, torn between seeing the confrontation through to its conclusion and the magnetic pull of her children. "What about you?" A ghost of a smile touched Drake's scarred face. "I'll finish here. Make sure all the evidence is properly secured. Then I'll find you." "Promise?" He nodded once. "You have my word." Sarah followed Sullivan from the bank, stepping into the late afternoon sunlight with a strange sense of unreality. After months of grief and struggle, after days of desperate flight and determined pursuit, justice was finally in motion. Walter Preston would face charges for his crimes. The Eastern investors, now aware of the true nature of their operation, were already discussing compensation for Milstead's displaced families. Sullivan's cousin's home proved to be a comfortable residence just 3 blocks from the bank. Sarah had barely stepped through the door when 3 identical blurs launched themselves at her with cries of joy. "Mama, you're safe! Did you catch the bad men? Did Mr. Drake help you?" Sarah gathered her daughters close, breathing in their familiar scent, feeling the solid reality of them in her arms. They were safe. They were together. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. Later that evening, as the triplets slept peacefully in a borrowed bedroom, Sarah sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint Cheyenne's skyline in gold and crimson. The day's events continued to replay in her mind. The confrontation, Preston's rage, the evidence finally brought to light. Footsteps on the walkway drew her attention. Drake approached, his expression uncharacteristically relaxed. He had exchanged the formal suit for more comfortable attire, though still cleaner than his trail clothes. "It's done," he announced without preamble, settling into the chair beside her. "Preston Jr. is in custody. His father has been detained for questioning. The marshal has all the evidence secured in the courthouse vault." And the Eastern investors, distancing, themselves rapidly from the entire operation. Drake's mouth quirked in something approaching a smile. They're already talking about establishing a fund for Milstead's displaced residents. Seems they're concerned about their reputations back east. Sarah nodded, gazing toward the darkening horizon. What happens now? Legal proceedings, testimony. Eventually, compensation for those who lost homes and livelihoods. Drake studied her profile. Judge McIntyre was impressed with your husband's documentation. With your permission, they'll use it to draft new mining safety regulations for the territory. Thomas would have wanted that, Sarah said softly. They sat in companionable silence as twilight descended, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue above. So much had changed in the span of a week. Her home destroyed, her life uprooted. Yet somehow, improbably, hope had emerged from the ashes. I've been thinking, Drake said finally, about what comes next for you and the girls. Sarah glanced at him, curious. In the rush of events, she had scarcely had time to consider their future beyond the immediate goal of justice. Sullivan mentioned land available near Junction Creek, good water, timber for building. Far enough from mining operations to be peaceful, close enough to the trading post for supplies and community. Drake kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. Could be a place to start over. Are you suggesting I become a homesteader, Mr. Drake? A woman alone with 3 young daughters? There was no bitterness in her question, merely practical consideration. Not alone, Drake replied quietly. Not unless you choose to be. The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah studied his profile, the scar that had once seemed fearsome now, simply a part of a face that had become dear to her. And what of the notorious Raven? She asked. Would he trade his hunting grounds for a homestead? Drake turned to face her directly. I've been hunting for a long time, Mrs. Calloway. Brought in my share of men who needed bringing in. Maybe it's time for a different path. His expression grew reflective. Your husband built evidence that will save lives long after he's gone. Makes me wonder what I might build, given the chance. Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened, and Catherine appeared in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes. Mama? I had a dream about our new house, she announced. It had a big porch and windows that looked at mountains. Sarah smiled, drawing her daughter onto her lap. Did it now? And was it a good dream? Catherine nodded solemnly. Mr. Drake was there too. He built us a swing in the big oak tree. Drake looked startled at being included in the child's dream of their future, but not displeased. Something in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a relaxing of the perpetual vigilance, told Sarah that Catherine's innocent vision had touched him deeply. Well, he said gruffly, every homestead needs a proper swing. Sarah met his gaze over her daughter's head, a silent understanding passing between them. The path ahead remained uncertain, with challenges and battles still to face. But for the first time since Thomas's death, the future held promise, rather than merely survival. As Cheyenne settled into the evening, lights appearing in windows across the city, Sarah Calloway held her daughter and contemplated new beginnings. From the ashes of Milstead, from the grief of loss, from the desperate flight through wilderness with her children, something unexpected had emerged. Not just justice, but the possibility of happiness. Beside her, Elijah Drake seemed equally content in the moment, the infamous bounty hunter at peace with a new hunt ending and, perhaps, a new life beginning. The Raven had risked everything to save a widow and her triplets from certain death. In doing so, he may have saved himself as well. Tell me more about this land near Junction Creek, Sarah said softly. It sounds like a good place to build something new. Drake's answering smile, rare and genuine, contained everything she needed. To know about tomorrow's possibilities, Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.